They've been delivered. In the last week's lesson, we said that God sends word to the people through Moses because God's been in communication with Moses, but as of yet, they're not Moses's. Israel is not God's people. They haven't accepted the proposal. Nothing's happened. So God communicates to Moses. God sends the word to the people. They accept it. But we were talking about God communicating to others through using people to communicate to others. And that one problem sometimes is that people are uninitiated or they're not in a relationship with God for him to be able to speak directly to them as clearly as he would somebody in a relationship. The other thing that we talked about and kind of touched on is the idea that a person in the relationship may not be consecrated. And we just touched on that very lightly. We're going to deal with it a little bit more now. Here we see that they've accepted his proposal and he's ready to show up on a mountain and demonstrate himself and show himself in a new way that they haven't experienced. And one of the things that we've talked about is that when a person accepts God's revelation or accepts God's proposal, he takes them further and shows himself more clearly than he previously had. And we showed that in Moses in the burning bush at one point. One of the key principles discussed throughout this series is that personal communication, as opposed to impersonal, personal communication with God takes place at sacred times and in sacred spaces. These events can take place rather spontaneously when God sees fit to reach out and touch an individual just because he is a loving and relational God, in which case it is impossible for an individual to engage in immediate preparation. In other words, sometimes God just reaches out and touches you. In the middle of a day, in the middle of doing things, he can speak to you. And we talk about sacred times and sacred spaces. Well, when God just says, hey, taps you on the shoulder to let you know he's thinking about you, you really don't have an opportunity to, we'll say, consecrate or make an event of it. It just happens in the course of normal relationships. But in this passage, Moses, in this passage, Moses, in this passage, let's see, where were we? God is about to appear before the nation that he is called to be his kingdom of priests, his holy nation, and his special people treasure among all the people of earth. God instructs the people to take 3 days to consecrate themselves. The nation is to commit time in anticipatory preparation of the groom whose proposal they have accepted. God's appearance in Exodus 19:6 is Israel's wedding day, and she has sanctified or set apart this sacred day by spending 3 days prior getting herself ready. This moment cannot be approached in a haphazard or profane manner. It is such a monumental occasion that it demands extra attention and a withdrawal from normal routines. So in other words, I'm just trying to set and explain why these 3 days are significant and what the purpose of it is. They're about to meet God as in a relational sense for the first time. And so in order to mark that occasion and make that day sacred, he tells them for 3 days to commit yourselves, tells them to wash their clothes, and there's other rituals of consecration he mentions, but so you're going to take 3 days to get ready for this one day, setting aside sacred time and sacred space. And the model that you see through scripture oftentimes is that this is preparation for a wedding. I can't say for a fact because my brain is kind of shorted out at the moment, but I believe that in a Jewish wedding there is a 3-day waiting period before the bridegroom and bride are presented. So this is a model or a type of a wedding that's about to take place. And anybody who's married knows that the days before, everything that you do, especially if you're actually trying to quarterback your own wedding, everything that you do is for those couple of days, maybe for the week before, is committed to setting up for that one day, and you hope that one day is perfect because this is huge. I'm about to be engaged and meet up with my husband for the first time. We're going to become husband and wife. There's a transition that's going to be taking place, and so we commit time to make that a special event, an occasion, after the months of planning and the headaches and everything else that Bruce and Raquel are going to avoid just by jumping on a plane and going somewhere and making things simple. But there's still time and thought going on because this day is special. It is important. Well, they're about to meet God, and he says, spend 3 days consecrating yourself. Contrast this model of spending 3 days getting ready with the manner in which the stereotypical Western American Christian handles an encounter with God in 2015. Conventionally, the sacred space of encountering God is still a building referred to as a church. And within that building, typically 30 seconds to 120 seconds before the service is supposed to start, the pastor or the minister or the devotion leader will announce over the sound system, "We're about to begin devotion. Please take a moment to elevate or consecrate your hearts and minds." Encountering God in a modern setting is an occasion of such significance that it warrants an entire 2 minutes of preparation. So people go to church. We're about to go to church. We're about to encounter God. We're about to encounter the Spirit of God. And what they say before, please consecrate and elevate your hearts and minds. We're about to begin devotion. Granted, today's society is much more fast-paced, with many more demands on everyone's time. However, even with that in mind, it would be difficult to argue that 2 minutes in 2015 shows the same reverence as 3 days or 4,320 minutes in the days of Moses. I'm a numbers person. An analytical person such as myself might theorize that Hebrews at Sinai that day were 2,160 times as consecrated as the average Christian is today, but that would not be entirely fair. It's just to show a contrast. We're busy, we run around, we do everything. They're about to meet God and hear God's voice, and he says, take 3 days to get ready for this. There is a difference. All joking aside, where encountering God and hearing his voice are involved, it's important to understand that consecration is key. If we want to experience and hear God's voice on a personal level, it's important to learn to take the initiative to make those moments and those times important. Not just I'm running around doing whatever I do, and then when I get done with all of it, I'm going to hopefully bump into God and we're going to talk. If I want to have a degree of intimacy with him, no different than with a husband or wife, no different than in a dating relationship, you take the time to make the moments matter, because you're not just dealing with somebody who's cute or somebody who you're in love with. Now you're interacting with God, and personal communications tend to take place in sacred times and at sacred moments. So the times that I set aside leads to me being able to hear God more clearly and more intimately. Those, for example, a person who spends Saturday night meditating on God while preparing Sunday dinner and thinking about service the next day is more likely, I'm not going to say definitive because there is no recipe, but a person who's spending time Saturday night thinking about listening to the songs or thinking about what's going to take place tomorrow is more likely to experience God in a more personal way or hear from him more clearly than somebody that spends Saturday night at the club. And that has nothing to do with what goes on in the club and whether or not it's a sinful thing or whether or not whatever they're engaged in. It's the fact that that person A, who spent Saturday night, consecrated themselves or prepared to have an encounter with God, and person B was busy doing whatever it was that they were doing, and they have treated it as something much less significant. And God sees it and he knows it and he understands. He also understands somebody that has to work 20 hours the night before church and doesn't have a chance. I mean, we serve an intelligent God. But for those who can consecrate the moment and don't consecrate the moment, he says, I'm going to interact with you on the basis of the relationship that we are experiencing and that we're having. One of the casualties of a fast-paced society to the liturgy of the church is that the average congregant wants to get in, get off, get out, and get on with their day. Anytime there's service, there is little anticipation, reference, or consecration given to the occasion anymore. The other side of that is that the church actually has to give somebody something to look forward to and anticipate, because if they're not doing that, then there's a bigger problem. But even at that, people just come and just do what they do and get, and don't actually take the time to realize or think about the fact that this is a corporate engagement with God. And that brings me to a side note that I meant to bring up at the beginning that I forgot about, but it's important. We get together here 3 times a month, hopefully, for an hour, and I get things from God. I try to share those things with you. One of the things that we have not done is as a group is give anything back to God. We receive from him. We hear from him, we're blessed. You guys bless me, I try to bless you guys. But that is a one-way experience. And we're going to start next week, going to start opening the Bible study with a 10, 15, maybe 15-minute devotionary period where we take the time to try to relate with God and give something back to him. It's something that I have been wanting to incorporate, but at the time it just seemed like something that would be nice to do. I guess in my growth and going through this process, it's something that's necessary for us to do. To take if this is supposed to be a moment where we encounter and we relate with God, we're going to treat it like a real relationship and give something back to him. So that's something that we're going to get into starting up with next week. I just wanted to give you guys a heads up. And like I said, I meant to bring it up at the beginning, but got sidetracked. But we're talking about actually having an experience with God. We're going to make it a two-way conversation and a two-way communication where we're not just receiving, but we're also giving. There are those deep individuals, getting back to the lesson, who have come to realize that God is not just confined to the walls of the church. And in his omnipresence, he can be encountered anywhere and at any time. So we just use the example of the church. Everybody comes to church and a lot of people don't give any thought to it. But there's some of us who know that God is everywhere. The church is not just the one spot you meet with God, that God can be encountered in your day-to-day life and in your normal interactions. This might logically lead to the conclusion that consecration is not just an event-driven occurrence but that it should be a lifestyle. In other words, if we realize God can be encountered at any time and we want to hear God more clearly, it would make sense logically to spend more time or be more invested in having a consecrated lifestyle because I can bump into God anytime. But that's not necessarily what happens. Unfortunately, far too often, these deep individuals find themselves stuck in the same time traps as everyone else and find it difficult to make time to carve out sacred times and sacred spaces to commune with God. We are fortunate that we serve a merciful and gracious God who works with us where we are and walks with us to where we need to be. So I want to encounter God. I want to hear God more clearly. I want to hear God's voice. I want them to tell me what I'm supposed to be doing with life. I want to understand myself. I want to understand him better. If I can experience God anywhere at any time, and I'm in a relationship, then consecrating myself, setting myself aside, setting our relationship aside at some point in time during my normal routine would be a logical step in the discipline process. But because we experience our relationship with God as a religion, sometimes more than a relationship, we're only committed to the few minutes that we'll give once a week, twice a week, to actually experiencing him if we get that much time. But hearing God's voice, those who are not consecrated will find it more difficult to hear his voice, if for no other reason that it's unfamiliar. Okay, look, that questions first, or comments, thoughts, because this is probably going to be the last pause that I give before we keep moving, just to make sure. Yes.
What's the consecration?
Outstanding question, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. The short answer of a consecration is that it is a ritual that sets aside or makes something special, makes a time period special. So, for example, in the passage in Exodus that we read, they went through a 3-day process. They washed their clothes. Out from Moses' instructions, they washed their clothes. They didn't have sex for 3 days. They broke their normal routine to prepare themselves to go and experience God. You've had concerts, right? You ever go over the material in your mind before the concert, either on the trip there or the night before? You've got this concert and you're going over the material in your mind before that would, to put it in these terms, you would be consecrating yourself or doing something to prepare yourself for that performance.
Okay.
Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
John?
It seems, I don't know, a good way of explaining this. You do better on a test if you study for it. If you know you got a test coming and you don't really pay it too much attention, you go in there and kind of wing it, you might do okay. But if you spend the night before actually looking over that material and get more familiar with it, and you'll do better once you get in there and get to it.
And that's true. We perform and we execute things better when our mind is geared towards those things. You know, encountering God isn't a test, but whatever we do, whether it's your job, whether it's your homework, whether it is going out on a date, when you're going out on a date and you actually take the time to pick out your clothes and look at what you're doing, when you're engaged before it happens, you end up having a better result in life in general. And that's one of the things we're going to get into in understanding what consecration means from a practical standpoint. I'm glad you asked that question because it was some very good lead in. Anybody else?
I was thinking, like the 2 minutes versus the 3 days, the here and the now. Does God present Himself here and now? You know, when it's necessary. Do you need 3 days
No.
to get ready? Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I'm like, if He's coming to you now and He taps you on the shoulder, I know I've been in some places in the shower.
Mm-hmm.
Presented so I'm like, is it something about the water or what is it? He presented himself and I'm like, okay, because I was just about to stop believing, but I'm glad you tapped me and let me know, hey, I'm still here.
Yep.
I'm hurt, but I need help.
And one of the things that I skipped over in my notes because I've accidentally just stumbled past it, I'm just pointing out Moses was not consecrated when he met God at the burning bush. Moses was doing what he was doing and he just saw something weird and went out and then God encountered him. Nothing for him to do to prepare for that. But once engaged in a relationship, and we said God can touch you and just say, hey, I just want you to know I'm thinking about you. I just want you to know I care. I understand and I see your feeling. We're talking about it, but when it comes to the process of having more personal experiences with Him, being consecrated helps you hear Him more clearly. And no, you don't need 3 days. There are times, and I hear you, see you, there are times where, and when I have to do a sermon, I'm spending a week sometimes getting ready if I know I have to do it. But there are times where get to church, we need somebody to preach. House full of preachers, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, I get, and God speaks to you and works with you and in that moment. And so you have a momentary encounter with God where He works through you. The flip side of that conversation, though, or of that situation, though, is that I'm not just coming off the top of my head. I've actually committed time and thought process leading up to that, so that way when I get there, there's something to work with. I may not be as connected as I would be if I knew I was getting up, but I've got a connection that I've been maintaining and working with throughout time.
You said at the beginning. You said God will send you away from your regular routine, like give you like a sign of something that He's trying to contact you.
Sometimes, yeah.
How do you know that it's God trying to contact you?
Oh, that's a good question. That's an outstanding question.
Because for Moses, wasn't it the lamb that just stumbled up the mountain and he stumbled in the bush?
Some of it is going to depend on your own worldview or your own understanding of what's happening in your life. I've said, and I think I may have said in an earlier lesson, that when it comes to people that are not in a relationship with God, sometimes stuff just happens. God can try to speak to them through this stuff, but sometimes you just have stuff that happens and things that go wrong or things that go right. And you can look for God in those circumstances. When you're dealing with the believer, though, or when you're dealing with somebody engaged in a relationship with God, there is very little that happens that's actually coincidence. And when we talk about the steps of a good man being ordered by the Lord or a righteous man being ordered by the Lord, when you're looking for God and when you're seeking after Him and looking to hear from Him, the stuff that happens that seems coincidental, sometimes there is a bigger picture that makes it less of a coincidence, but you don't necessarily see it until it's all over with. That doesn't necessarily answer the question of how do I know it's God. Sometimes it's a question of whether you don't necessarily know in the moment. And I think that's probably the most honest answer I can give you. You don't necessarily know in the moment. Sometimes it doesn't click until after you've come out on the other side of it. Stuff goes wrong, you can't figure out why. Stuff goes right, you can't figure out why. And further up the road, once you have a chance to look back at it, you understand that this was God shaping and directing my life. Because the way that it played out couldn't have been anything other than God. And then you have a choice as to what you're going to believe. Do I believe it's God or do I believe it's coincidence? Well, if my walk is with God and I've been asking Him to direct me and to show me, then I believe that my prayers are being heard. Does that make sense? So there's not a cut and dry answer. And everybody establishes an individual dynamic with God, an individual relationship with God, to where there are certain ways that you know He's speaking to you because you've had enough experience with Him to be able to recognize that. When you're first starting out, you trip, you stumble. Sometimes you know, sometimes you don't know. Sometimes you ask somebody. Sometimes you don't see it and somebody else can point it out to you and it's like, oh yeah, that was God. But it's a learning process because you're learning to experience and hear things and exercise senses that you're not used to on a normal basis exercising. Does that make sense? So we're gonna move on a little bit. To be entirely fair, it's worth noting that although much lip service is paid to the idea of consecration across pulpits, and while deep pastors have their secret recipes for what folks ought to be doing to consecrate themselves, much of the conversation is superficial and anecdotal. Consequently, many, if not most people, lack any sort of concrete concepts of what it means, why it's important, and how it might work. So you hear about people talk about consecration in church all the time. And what I gave you was a very superficial answer when you asked about it because it's the amount of time that I have to commit to it. And I knew that I was going to be talking a little bit more about it later. But most of the time we talk about consecration, people actually have no idea what you're talking about. They just think that means I should come to church more often, because usually when people talk about pastor talks about being consecrated, he's just trying to get you to come to church more often, really, or be more involved in church. It's much bigger than that. And so we're going to deal with this in a little bit broader context. In Exodus 19:9, God says He's going to speak to Moses so the people can hear Him speak and trust Moses as a leader. Verses 16 through 19 describe the sound of God's voice as thunder or a blast from a ram's horn. Yet Moses heard discernible words. So what we read a few minutes ago, God says, everybody get ready. They're going to hear me speak. You're going to see me. They see fire and they hear thunder. Moses hears the same sounds, but he hears discernible words. He hears God call him up to the mountain. This illustrates a couple of different ideas that I'm not going to talk about right now, but everybody heard and saw something after having been consecrated. Why did Moses hear a voice and they heard thunder? Don't have time to talk about it right now, but it's an interesting dichotomy as to why God can speak to one person in a crowd. Other people don't necessarily recognize it, but the individual who's being spoken to got the message. Well, I gotta move. Psychological anthropologists and neuroscientists would say that these events took place in an alternate state of consciousness. So they spent 3 days consecrating themselves. They get to the mountain. What we would say now in our scientific terms is that they had an experience in what we call an alternate state of consciousness. And this is where I'm going to introduce and get more into next week. Between 1963 and 1980 and 1969, Ohio State University anthropologist Erica Bourguignon held a public health service grant from the National Institutes of Mental Health to pursue research on dissociational states. She and her colleagues read and analyzed the ethnographic literature on this topic in a sample of 488 societies from all parts of the world. This sample included 44 circum-Mediterranean societies, 1/6 of the major ethnographic regions represented in Murdoch's Ethnographic Atlas. The result was that 437, or 90% of these cultures, reported one or more institutionalized, culturally patterned alternate states of consciousness. In the circum-Mediterranean world, 80% of the societies experienced ASCs, or alternate states of consciousness. ASCs are defined as the condition in which sensations, perceptions, cognition, and emotions are altered. These are characterized by changes in sensing, perceiving, thinking, and feeling. In addition, these states modify the relation of the individual to the self, the body, one's sense of identity, and the environment of time, space, or other people. They are induced by modifying sensory input, either directly or indirectly. In general, neuroscientists and anthropologists agree that at all times and in all places, people have been capable of actually entering into a variety of ASCs. Indeed, the potential to shift voluntarily or involuntarily between states of consciousness is a function of the universal human nervous system. All people have to cope with different states of consciousness in one way or another. So what we're talking about, and the research started, like I said, in 1963. I've got reports and data and evidence as far as recent as 2010, where people went and took the cultures of the world. This was not an exclusive Christian study. Looked at the world's cultures, their religions, studied both anthropologists, neurologists, and psychologists, and studied their cultures and found that everybody, just about, except for maybe America or Western modern cultures, have within that culture some kind of process or ritual in which they can enter into a state where their mind and their ability to, and their perceptions of reality are altered. You hook them up to an EEG, there is a change in their brainwave activity. There's a change in the way that they perceive things. Whether you're talking about witch doctors, shamans, transcendental meditation, peyote, whatever it is, getting ready to go on a vision quest. Almost everybody has some kind of cultural ritual on which they perceive their reality differently. Like I said, not just a Christian thing, not just a Jewish thing, but almost worldwide. Most cultures have that ingrained in their culture. We say, well, let me not get too far ahead of myself. Yeah, I'm good. Even those Western cultures who, because of their scientific and psychological socialization, tend to be skeptical or even resistant to these experiences, have more of them than they realize. Those who drink alcohol know the effect of 1, 2, or more drinks on the consciousness. Those who drive automobiles admit that they have often arrived at their destination and can't remember the trip. The drive, especially if driving alone, has been in an ASC commonly known as road trance. Practically everyone has daydreamed in class or during a lecture or a sermon or a concert or on many other occasions. You think about it, you're sitting in a high school classroom, you're sitting in the college classroom, and your brain goes off somewhere else because this person is droning on in a monotone tone of voice. Physically speaking, your ears are working. The sound is hit, the vibrations are making their way into your ear canal. It's stimulating the hairs that create the neurotransmitters that actually cause the perception of sound in the brain. But the professor calls on you and you don't have a clue what he said. You don't even remember him talking. Your brain has shifted gears, alternate states of consciousness. These are all instances of changing levels of awareness. As the examples just mentioned suggest, levels of awareness change often during the day, preparing a meal, listening to a lecture, driving, watching TV, and so on. Most of the time, a person is unaware of the shift and realizes it only when forced to return from that in which he or she was distracted. You get off in a daydream, you don't realize you're daydreaming until somebody pops you upside the head or calls on you and calls out your name and makes something register. It's like, oh shoot, I wasn't here. Mediterranean believers are more likely to interpret an ASC experience as an encounter with someone from the realm of God, while scientifically sophisticated Western believers may be inclined to interpret such experiences as hallucinations or something that's pathological, perhaps an alien from outer space or a UFO. The society, country, or culture of origin influences the way in which a person interprets their experience. So over here, we say we're daydreaming. Over in India, they say you went on a vision quest. Which one is true? We'll get into that more in subsequent lessons. What's the difference between somebody hearing voices and somebody hearing the voice of God? We're going to get into that. And there's only so much I can actually get into without turning it into a college course, but we're going to touch on things enough to give you an operational way of being able to understand and think about things from what they're finding out. In her early research, Dr. Felicitas Goodman, a student of Dr. Bourguignon and a definitive expert in the phenomenon of glossolalia, also known as speaking in tongues. Y'all didn't know somebody actually did a scientific study on tongue speaking. We just thought, but there's a definitive expert, Felicitas Goodman, studied it across on a global scale. Phenomenon of speaking in tongues, concluded that the trance, or a form of ASC, experience tends to be vacuous. If no belief system is proffered, it will remain vacuous. And by vacuous, it means empty, it means nothing. You go into a trance, nothing happens. If you are cultured, if you're enculturated to expect something to happen, then you tend to interpret something to happen. That was her early research, as early as 1990. If no belief system was proffered, it will remain vacuous. It is a neurophysiological event that receives context only from signals present in the respective cultures. That was her understanding in 1990. However, her subsequent research proved that neurophysiological events are not really vacuous, but always occur in the context of a belief system, mythology, or ideology. Those were her findings as of 2001. ASCs are thus filled with culturally significant and expected scenarios. Without a key to interpret the experience, the individual believes it to be vacuous, but with the aid of a belief system, the individual can interpret the visuals, provide a soundtrack, and the interpretation. The understanding and interpretation, for example, of a vision derives from the culture, more specifically what anthropologists call a culture's latent discourse, or traditions of the culture, or their cultural dogma. A person learns and remembers these traditions and rely upon them for making sense out of the experiences as needed. In our scientific culture, the latent discourse responds with skepticism to any mention of ASC experiences. So let me back up, because we're introducing the idea of an alternate state of consciousness. And what they're saying is that your cultural bias or background influences how you interpret what you're experiencing in an alternate state of consciousness. And this isn't just something that happens with religions. This is something they have studied this with athletes, with LeBron James caliber level athletes, to where they go into a zone, and all of a sudden, one of the reasons that they're able to operate and do things that other people can't do is because their mind and their senses are operating on a different level and a different speed than everybody else's are. And when they get in the zone, they're operating differently than their own base level even is. That's why you get to the game early, do shoot around, sit there, get your head together, is because you are psychologically shifting your mind's gear to be able to experience everything around you in a different perspective than what you normally would have been able to. We'll bring it into a religious context later and into communication with God, but this is just laying groundwork for what we're going to hit next week. In our scientific-minded culture, the latent discourse responds with skepticism to any mention of ASC experiences. Indeed, they are often considered to be signs of pathology or psychopathy. In our culture, people who hear voices and communicate with persons that aren't there are said to be mentally ill. In contrast, in the biblical world, latent discourse is basically the Israelite tradition that believes God communicates with people on a normal basis. During the time that the minister, or young Samuel, ministered to the Lord Eli, a revelation from the Lord was uncommon and visions were infrequent. But the prophets of Israel, as well as members of the Jesus movement and subsequent Jesus movements, all shared a common latent discourse. In other words, the reason that we have a difficulty with the idea of visions, and we don't know about dreams, and are they real, and do we interpret them, our culture is one of the ones that does not have a cultural basis through which we interpret this. We interpret it from a scientific perspective, and so when somebody says they hear voices, we think they need to be put on Ritalin or Prozac, and sometimes they do. And so how do you know the difference between the two? We'll talk about that more later. But the fact of the matter is that one of the biggest challenges that we deal with as Westerners is that we have a hard time figuring out how to deal with alternate states of consciousness, because we don't believe that they exist. We think they're just cause for medication. We boil everything down to scientific propositions rather than understanding that the human body is wired to be able to experience a broader category of reality than what we normally do in our daily interactions. And that's what these social or psychological anthropologists and neurologists have been constructing. And they've gotten to where they can pinpoint the parts of the brain that are stimulated. There's something called a top-down stimulation, where it happens by deep, intense focus. There's something called a bottom-up stimulation, where sensory input is overloaded and it causes you to start to experience different things differently. There's a lot of science that nobody talks about because we get scared of science in religious circles, but there's a lot of Christian people that have done scientific study that are trying to bridge the models between Mediterranean culture, where everything's spiritual, Western culture, where everything's scientific. Where's the middle ground between the two? Are they two contrary propositions, or is there a model? Is there a way of being able to discuss things on both sides of the equation and everybody's saying the same thing? So I have to wrap this up. There's much more to be discussed. This is just a very high, general level introduction of ASC. For the purposes of this discussion, as to consecration, rituals of consecration can be used to induce an ASC or to make a person more susceptible to it. So you spend the time, you're focused on the music, you actually get up to perform, you know exactly what's supposed to be happening, partially because you've memorized it. Sometimes you end up performing better, though, because you get zoned in and you have made yourself susceptible to be able to experience the moment differently than you otherwise would have. And I'll explain a little bit more about that later. But in terms of what we're talking about, they went through a 3-day consecration period. They go to the mountain, they experience something completely different. Possibly, you could theorize that they are experiencing that in an alternate state of consciousness. These issues will be discussed in more detail in the next lesson. So that brings us up to the point, like we said, we've talked about and brought up tendencies and commonalities that you see in things that God tends to do when he talks to people, but we haven't actually gotten to the meat of hearing God's voice yet. This is going to take us in a slightly different direction, where we try to understand, how does a person actually experience God as more than a psychological proposition? How do they encounter God in something other than an emotional proposition? Were the apostolic folks crazy? Or maybe they tapped into something that they didn't necessarily understand that they were tapping into. Are the scientists crazy and closed-minded, or maybe they're just coming at this from a different perspective? And where's the overlap between the two? How do we discuss and have this conversation so that way we can talk about hearing from God and people don't think that we need to be medicated? So that's where we're at with this, and we'll pick it up again next week. Any last-minute questions before I fly out the door? Let's have a